fellas, the UFC and MMA as a whole is very diverse. There's multiple different fighters from multiple different countries and regions, so I thought I'd go through the top 3 greatest fighters from every country in MMA, not just the UFC, because we've got to expand it to MMA as a whole, but the top 3 greatest fighters from every country. And when I say every country, I mean like the main countries, not just a country with like 3 fighters on the roster. I'm talking about the countries who have a deep roster full of fighters in history and as of right now. So we're going to be going through the 3 greatest, the most accomplished, the most skilled, and we'll start off with the first country, which is Russia. Russia's definitely one of the best in MMA. The talent pool in Russia is insane. So at number 3 for Russia, I'm going to go with Fedor Emelianenko. People like to call Fedor a can crusher, and I completely disagree. Listen, was he facing talent like Tom Aspinall and Francis Ngannou? No, he wasn't. But he was beating everyone at his era. He was beating everyone at the highest level at his time. He dominated Pride in his prime. He was unbeatable in his prime with Fedor Emelianenko. People look at Fedor Emelianenko still as the most unbeatable heavyweight of all time. Some people still think he beats Tom Aspinall. Some people think Prime Fedor would be the UFC champion today if he was in the UFC. He went on a 10-year unbeaten streak. 10 years of not losing to anyone. Imagine a heavyweight in the UFC was to do that nowadays, just go on a 10-year unbeaten streak. That would be crazy. And he just destroyed everyone who was put in front of him. The best heavyweights in the world at his era. He just demolished everyone. Whether it be by submission, whether it be by KO. He looked unstoppable on the feet. He looked unstoppable on the ground. And I think we've got to give Fedor Emelianenko his props. People like to call him a can crusher. They're just saying that because he wasn't, beating notable people at the time. And I understand the competition might have not been the best, but that was the best at his era. So I'm going to say that Fedor Emelianenko is the 3rd greatest Russian of all time, and I think you've got to include him in at least the top 3 greatest or top 15 greatest fighters of all time from any country. So at number 3 for Russia, I'm going to go with Mr. Fedor Emelianenko, and then at number 2, I'm going to go with one of the most popular UFC fighters and MMA fighters of all time, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, I don't need to explain why Khabib's one of the greatest of all time, and I think even if you hate Khabib, you've got to include him in at least the top 10 greatest of all time. I'm going to put him at number 2 for Russia because he just dominated the lightweight division. Everyone knew that what Khabib was going to do. He was going to try and take you down, wear you out, and get the submission or beat you with ground and pound, and nobody could stop it. He was undefeated, as one of the cleanest records in the UFC at 29-0, and he's had some pretty good wins. Conor McGregor, the biggest fight in UFC history, finished Dustin Poirier, finished Justin Gaethje, Michael Johnson, Rafael dos Santos, Edson Barboza. Now, the reason I can't really put him anything above number 2 is because, he only had 3 title defenses. We talk about Fedor dominating for years. Khabib only dominated his era of MMA and got 3 wins against stylistically favourable matchups, and like I said, only managed to get 3 title defences, and I just don't think he went on for long enough. He didn't win a belt in a second weight class, didn't really do anything more, and he just gave up after, well, he didn't give up, but he stopped after 3 defences. So Khabib, I'm going to put him at number 2. Definitely one of the most dominant lightweights we've ever seen. Never lost inside the octagon. Some would argue that he's never actually lost a round either, so I'm going to put Khabib at number 2, and then at number 1, I'm going to go with the current lightweight champion of the world, Islam Makhachev. I think he's got a better resume than Khabib, a much better resume than Khabib. He beat Charles Oliveira for the belt. Charles Oliveira is a much more stylistic issue than anyone that Khabib has faced before, and he submitted Charles Oliveira, who's one of the best submission artists in the UFC. He beat pound for pound number 1 Alexander Volkanovski twice. He KO'd him on one occasion when Volkanovski's one of the best in the UFC on the feet. He beat Dustin Poirier as well, beat Dan Hooker, beat Bobby Green, beat Drew Dober, and he's still defending to this day, and he beat Arman Tsarukyan. He's faced stylistic nightmares and passed the test, and like I said, he's still going to this day. Now, do I think he's going to win a belt in a second weight class? I don't, because now Belal Muhammad's the champion. I don't think they're ever going to do that, but even already, I think his resume is more impressive than Khabib. His record's 26-1, so he has lost before, but at the end of the day, I don't really look at losses too much. I look at what they've actually accomplished, and I think as of right now, Makhachev has already accomplished more than Khabib, and he's still got, more time to accomplish even more than what he's already done. So the greatest Russian of all time, in my opinion, is going to go to Islam Makhachev. Then we'll go to the UK. We recently had UFC 304, in my opinion, the most stacked card in British MMA history, and we left with 1 champion, came in with 2 champions. So at number 3 for the 3rd greatest fighter in UK MMA history, I'm going to go with Tom Aspinall. I know he's only just started, well, what seems like he's just kicked off his MMA career because he's only just won the belt, but I'm going to say Tom Aspinall is the 3rd greatest. Now, he's only got a record of 15-3, but what he's done in the UFC so far is absolutely mental. Every single fighter that he has beaten in the UFC, he has finished within 1 or 2 rounds. In fact, the only guy that's actually made it to round 2 is Andrei Arlovski. He's got the shortest average fight time in UFC history. He's got the shortest fastest bottom percentage time in UFC history, well, not in history, but as of right now. I think he's got like 1 second on the bottom, which is when he slipped against Volkov, and he's already got a really good resume. He's probably he's cleared out the heavyweight division. Well, nearly cleared out. He hasn't beaten Garn and Jones, but he beat Volkov, he beat Spivak, he beat Pereira, he beat Pavlovich when Pavlovich had the 6-fight first-round KO streak. He beat Curtis Blades, who was a stylistic nightmare. I think he'd beat John Jones, and I think he's the heavyweight champion of the world. John Jones don't want to fight him for one reason, and that's because he's terrifying. He's dangerous on the feet, he's a dangerous grappler, and I think he will retire as the greatest heavyweight of all time. Again, I don't really want to, give him accomplishments that he hasn't got yet, but already he is looking like he could be one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, and he's already accomplished so much. He's one of the 3 only British champions. So at number 3, I'm going to go with Tom Aspinall. He just seems like an absolute beast. Bet the house on Aspinall in every fight. At number 2, I'm going to go with the guy who just lost his belt, Leon Rocky Edwards. Now, Leon, even though his title run was very short, he has a decent career in the UFC. His only losses went to Claudio Silva, Kamaru Usman, who he's 2-1 against, and recently to Bilal Muhammad. And apart from that, he basically just beat everyone that was put in front of him. He had some good wins on his resume before the title run. Brian Barberena, Vicente Luque, Donald Cerrone, Gunnar Nelson, Rafael dos Santos, and obviously the big fight with Nate Diaz. And his title run is what puts him at number 2, in my opinion, because he beat pound for pound number 1, the second greatest welterweight of all time, Kamaru Usman, with one of the greatest KOs in UFC history. And then he proved that he wasn't a fluke by going to the UK and beating him in a rematch. Then he went against Colby Covington, beat Colby Covington at his own game as well. First guy to take down Kamaru Usman in the UFC as well. First guy to drop Usman. So his title reign, even though it was very short and only lasted just over a year, he's already accomplished a lot in the UFC as Leon Edwards. Now, he has just lost to Bilal Muhammad. I don't think he's going to be a champion again, but because he's had minimal losses, he went on 2 massive streaks in the UFC. I mean, if you take away the no contest from Bilal Muhammad, that's 1 massive streak. And he actually won the belt and got 2 defenses, which no British fighter has done yet. I'm going to say that Leon Edwards is the second greatest fighter of all time from the UK. Very well-rounded. One of the few Brits that actually like to impose offensive wrestling. So I'm going to say Leon Edwards is number 2. And at number 1, I've got to go with the Count Michael Bisping. You look at Leon Edwards, and he kind of tends to he doesn't really have that much heart. I know he had the head kick knockout, but when times get tough for Leon Edwards, he seems like he kind of just mentally gives up. Bisping's the opposite. This dude was fighting roid heads at the time with one eye, and he was just, I'm not going to say he was dominated, but this dude was the definition of tough. Fought with one eye, won the belt with one fucking eye, and he was fighting roid heads as well. You got to remember, when Bisping was on his run, he was fighting juice heads, roid heads, and he was beating a lot of these guys. And even though he did lose multiple times, he got sent to the shadow realm by Gastelum, the KO by Dan Henderson as well. Vitor Belfort took his eye away. He was very tough, was Bisping. Went on a bit of a streak, beat Anderson Silva, got KO'd in that fight, but he didn't count as a KO because his mouthpiece fell out. Then goes back after getting KO'd and, just starts putting the pressure on Silva. Beat Anderson Silva. Then he KOs Luke Rockhold for the belt in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history and is the first British fighter to win a belt. And then defends against Dan Henderson, who had once KO'd him. So for number 1, I'm going to go with Michael Bisping. I do think, it's very easy to overtake Bisping. Well, not easy, but I think Tom Aspinall has potential. But because he won the belt, got a defense, did it with one eye, and was beating a bunch of juice heads in his era, I'm going to say that Bisping is the greatest fighter to come from the UK. I don't think it's impossible to overtake him, but I still think as of right now, he is at number 1. Then we've got America. I think America's probably got the most stacked roster when it comes to American fighters. There's so many fighters that come from America. At number 3, I'm going to go with Daniel Cormier. Daniel Cormier, I mean, he only lost to Stipe and Jones. Those are the only guys he lost to. He lost to the greatest heavyweight of all time, and he lost to the greatest of all time. Apart from that, he battered everyone. He has some of the most dominant wrestling in the UFC. In the Strikeforce days, he was dominating everybody with his wrestling. Comes up to the UFC, continues to dominate people, wins the light heavyweight belt, then goes up and wins the heavyweight belt of all time. A heavyweight belt as well, I mean. Definitely top 15 greatest of all time is Daniel Cormier. Had some really good wins on there as well. Beat Stipe Miocic by KO, which was a massive upset at the time. Dominated Volkan Oezdemir, dominated Derek Lewis, dominated Anthony Johnson, beat Alexander Gustafsson. Had the win over Silva, but it was a short notice fight, so I'm not going to look into that too much. But no, DC in his prime was absolutely unstoppable. He's one of the best wrestlers in UFC history. Won a belt in 2 different weight classes. Only lost to Jones and Stipe as well, who were the greatest in their weight classes. So I'm going to say that DC is the 3rd most accomplished American fighter of all time. Like, he just dominated everyone. Multiple different styles, multiple different fighters. This dude just out-wrestled, picked them up, dunked them on the head, and dominated them. So I'm going to put DC at number 3. And again, like I said before, won a belt in 2 different weight classes. And number 2, I'm going to go with one of the greatest of all time. Top 3 greatest of all time, in my opinion. And it is Demetrius Johnson. Demetrius Johnson is the greatest flyweight of all time, undoubtedly. And again, similar to Fedor Emelianenko, a lot of people like to discredit him, saying, oh, it was a flyweight division, the talent wasn't the best, but he dominated the flyweight division at his era. He dominated the flyweight division at the time. No one was beating Demetrius Johnson. He was just dominating everyone at the time, and he was so skilled. His jiu-jitsu, his wrestling, his striking, he was just levels above every single flyweight. The best flyweights in the world were getting made look like amateurs when they fought Demetrius Johnson, because Demetrius Johnson was just that skilled. Then came in, obviously still fighting to this day in 1FC, winning in 1FC. He's the 1FC champion as well. His only losses in the UFC to Henry Cejudo and Dominic Cruz as well, which aren't the worst losses because they're some of the best. And the Henry Cejudo fight was a very, very close decision. Demetrius Johnson is definitely one of the greatest of all time. With an MMA record of 25-4, dominated the flyweight division, one of the most skilled fighters of all time. Some would say he is the most skilled fighter of all time. I'm going to say Demetrius Johnson is the 3rd greatest American. At number 1, I'm going to go with the greatest of all time in MMA as a whole, and I'm going to go with Jon Jones. Now, even though he's holding up the heavyweight division and he took steroids, it's hard to deny that Jon Jones isn't the greatest. We like to talk about fighters on this list and how, you know, they dominated their era of the UFC. Jon Jones didn't just dominate his era. He dominated every era of the UFC. He dominated when he was young, when he was beating guys like Shogun, Rampage, Lyoto Machida. He dominated his era of the UFC when he was beating guys like DC, which is a win that's aged really well because he's one of the greatest Americans. Gustafsson, OSP, Anthony Smith, Thiago Santos, and then he dominated the next generation of champions when he beat the next generation heavyweight in Cyril Gane. And I know it's a stylistically favourable matchup, but he beat Cyril Gane and won the heavyweight belt. He's won a belt in 2 different weight classes. He's currently the heavyweight champion. It's kind of crazy, and I know, you know, he's holding up the division, but it's kind of crazy how we're here in 2024 and he is a champion, and he was also a champion back in 2011. And I feel like that's kind of crazy. And he's had 13 title defenses as well. I mean, most champions these days can't even seem to get like 3 or 4 defenses. This dude got 13. Greatest light heavyweight of all time. Outstruck the best strikers. Outgrappled the best grapplers. Nobody could beat this dude, no matter what the style, no matter how talented they were. Nobody could beat Jon Jones. And even though I do think he loses to Tom Aspinall, you can't deny what he's accomplished already in MMA is incredible. I mean, 27-1, and technically that one loss should have been, like, it shouldn't have counted as a DQ with the new rules in MMA. I count that as 28-0, so I'm going to say that Jon Jones is not only the greatest American, but the greatest fighter in UFC history as a whole. Then we've got Australia and New Zealand. I've kind of categorized them both into one because, you know, there's no point doing it separately. At number 3 for the greatest Australian/New Zealand fighter, I'm going to go with Dan Hooker. Now, Dan Hooker hasn't won the belts. He hasn't gone on this massive unbeaten streak, but Dan Hooker's fought pretty much everyone at the top level. He's so tough. He had that war with Jalen Turner in which he won. That fight with Dustin Poirier was amazing. Beat Paul Felder. Beat Gilbert Burns when Gilbert Burns was at lightweight. KO'd him. Beat Jim Miller. Submitted Mark Jacasey, who's a really good grappler as well. And he's just basically been at the top for the longest time. He's a ranked lightweight still. And the only guys that he's really lost to have been the top guys. Dustin Poirier in a very close fight as well. He made Dustin Poirier, and that was an absolute scrap, let's just put it that way. Lost to Chandler. Lost to the pound for pound number 1 Islam Makhachev. Got steamrolled by Arnold Allen, but I'm going to put him at number 3, 23-12, ranked lightweight, still has potential to make it into the deeper into the top 10 if he beats Gamrot, and he's just had so many good fights in his time. I'm going to say Dan Hooker is the 3rd greatest Australian of all time. And then at number 2, I'm going to go with Robert the Reaper Whittaker. I'd put him in my top 3 greatest middleweights of all time. If Israel Adesanya didn't exist, he would have been the dominated middleweight champion for so long. I mean, already his resume in the middleweight division is absolutely ridiculous. Derek Brunson, Yoel Romero twice, Darren Till, Jared Cannonier, Gastelum, Vittori, Costa, that recent win over Ikram Aliskerov, arguably beat Israel Adesanya in that second fight that they had. I think he has potential to win a belt again. I think if Sean Strickland becomes the champion against either Dricus or Adesanya and then Whittaker gets his shot, I think he's got a really good chance. Whittaker's just so good, man. Like, the only guys he loses to are the best. He lost to Adesanya, who's the 2nd greatest middleweight of all time. He lost to Dricus du Plessis, who's the current middleweight champion of the world. He's just so good, is Robert Whittaker. Recently fraud-checked Ikram Aliskerov, an amazing striker. He can grapple, he can do everything. 27-7, former champion as well. Robert Whittaker's one of the best, man. He's so good. So I'm going to say that Robert Whittaker's the second greatest fighter to come from Australia/New Zealand. And number one, it's got to be Alexander Volkanovski. In my opinion, definitely the top 10 greatest of all time. Maybe you could argue that he's top 5 as well. He's the greatest featherweight, or at least one of the greatest featherweights of all time. I mean, what is it? Beating Max Holloway 3 times. Look how good Holloway is. He beat that dude 3 times, with the third one being the most decisive. Brian Ortega, Korean Zombie, Yair Rodriguez dominated him. Arguably beat the best fighter in the world right now, Islam Makhachev, in that first fight when he moved up to the lightweight division. And he's on a 2-fight losing streak, but he's definitely one of the greatest featherweights of all time. His run was, he was just dominating everyone as well. Jose Aldo as well, Chad Mendes. It's hard to deny that Alexander Volkanovski isn't the greatest fighter to come from Australia. He dominated everyone. He was just battering people at their own game. He seemed pretty much untouchable. And yeah, I'm going to have to put Alexander Volkanovski the Great, 26-4, at number 1 for the greatest fighter to come from Australia/New Zealand. Then we've got Brazil. Brazil, again, one of the best countries when it comes to producing talent. So many Brazilian fighters, so many Brazilian champions. At number 3, I'm going to go with the current light heavyweight champion, Alex Pereira. I don't think there's been a fighter in MMA that has accomplished as much as Alex Pereira in the time span that he has had. He joined the UFC in 2021 and has already beaten multiple former champions and won a belt in 2 completely different weight classes. Joins the UFC, knocks out Sean Strickland, a former champion. Knocks out, well, the first guy actually to beat Israel Adesanya in the middleweight division. Then he loses to Adesanya, moves up to a different division, beats Jan Blachowicz, knocks out Yuri Prochazka, former champion for the belt, knocks out Jamal Hill, former champion for the belt, knocks out Yuri Prochazka again as another defense, and he's still the defending light heavyweight champion. And for all we know, he could go up and win a heavyweight belt as well. What Pereira's done in the short amount of time that he's been in MMA is absolutely incredible. He's beaten so many champions. He seems like he's unstoppable in the light heavyweight division right now. First guy to beat Adesanya at middleweight. Like I said, KO'd Strickland as well, which is a win that is really well considering how Strickland's career went after that KO. I'm going to put Alex Pereira at number 3. He hasn't got this long list of defenses, but the amount of people and the amount of talent that he has beaten in the short time he's been in MMA, you've just got to give him the credit for it. And he might be the scariest striker in the UFC right now. And we talk about Khabib, how everyone knows what he's going to do. He's going to try and take you down and maul you. We know what Pereira's going to do. He's going to try and land that left hook, but no one can seem to stop it. So I'm going to put Pereira at number 3. At number 2, I'm going to go who I would put as the greatest featherweight of all time, Jose Aldo. People don't give this dude enough credit. Before that fight with Conor McGregor, he was dominating everyone. I mean, he had an insane run in WEC, which is basically the featherweight division for a promotion that was essentially UFC level talent. Won the belt in WEC, became the champion in the UFC, just dominated for years and years and years. No one could beat this guy. The fight with Frankie Edgar, Chad Mendes, Korean Zombie, he was just dominating everyone. And then even after he lost to Conor McGregor, okay, he might have lost to McGregor, Volkanovski, Holloway, whoever, but he still managed to pick up wins in different divisions as well. Even right now in the bantamweight division, he got wins over Marlon Vera, Pedro Munoz, Rob Font, that recent win over Jonathan Martinez in the bantamweight division. He's so good, it's Jose Aldo. In his era, when he was dominating the featherweight division, no one was beating this dude. And now that he's come down to bantamweight, he's still competing at the highest level as well. You've got to give Jose Aldo his credit. I think he's the second greatest Brazilian of all time. And at number 1, I'm going to go with Anderson Silva now. I understand the second half of his career was kind of, it was kind of low level, but one thing I will say about Anderson Silva is he just dominated. And I know I've said this about 10 times video, but there was no one that could beat Anderson Silva in his prime. This dude was making everyone look so easy. He made it look like he was just destroying everyone with minimal effort. This dude's running the UFC. The amount of defenses he had was absolutely insane. Won the belt and just beat everyone. Dan Henderson, Rich Flankin, Forrest Griffin as well, Damian Maia, Chaelson and Vito Belfort, Stephen Bonner. This dude was just beating everyone, and then he went on a massive losing streak towards the end of his career, but to be fair to him, it was out of his prime. He was old, and he was coming off a massive injury to Chris Weidman when he lost the belt. Anderson Silva, in my opinion, is the greatest Brazilian of all time. Dominated his era of MMA, 34 wins. Anderson the Spider Silva, arguably the greatest striker in UFC history as well, just beating everyone, KOing everyone, and he was a very slow-paced type of fighter, and then he'd just find a way to clip everyone and make them look like complete amateurs out there. He just looked in the Matrix every time he fought. I'm going to put Anderson Silva as the greatest Brazilian fighter of all time. Then we go to Canada. Canada, I mean, there's definitely one major fighter from Canada, but number 3 for the third greatest Canadian fighter, I'm going to go with Patrick Cormier. Patrick Cormier, he wasn't the most consistent in the UFC, and he did go have quite a lot of losing streaks, but he had a lot of good wins in his run as well, in his career as well. From 2007 to 2008, went on a 5-fight unbeaten streak, 3 of them come by way of third round KO. Then he went again in 2012 to 2014. 3-fight winning streak, and then from 2015 to 2016 again, winning streak as well. He was a very powerful guy, and he fought a lot of the top guys as well, fighting guys like Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, Alan Belcher, Anderson Silva as well. He was a very tough guy, was Patrick Cormier. Got a record of 23-11, and before the UFC, this dude obviously deserved his run in the UFC. For Patrick Cormier, I'm going to say that he's the third greatest Canadian fighter of all time. Very tough was this dude, and basically fought whoever it was at the time. He didn't give a fuck who was on top at the time. He was fighting that kind of level, and he was fighting in 2017 as well. His UFC career spanned all the way from 2007 to 2017, and he won in 2016 as well. So I'm going to say Patrick Cormier is the third greatest Canadian fighter. And number 2, I'm going to go with the infamous Rory MacDonald. This guy has been involved in arguably the greatest fight in UFC history when he fought Robbie Lawler. That fight was absolutely amazing, but no, he's got a really good run in the UFC, Rory MacDonald, with a record of 19-14, with wins over guys like Nate Diaz, BJ Penn, Damian Maia, Tyrone Woodley as well. He's beaten some really good names in the UFC, and he's had minimal losses. He lost to Robbie Lawler twice, one of them being one of the greatest fights in UFC history. Went to a decision with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and he lost to Carlos Condit, who was one of the best at the time as well. He's had a really good run in the UFC as Rory MacDonald. He's had some really good wins on his resume as well. So I'm going to say that Rory MacDonald is the second greatest fighter to come from Canada. And at number 1, the Canadians better be grateful for this man right here. GSP. If it wasn't for GSP, MMA in Canada would be nowhere near as big as it is right now. This dude is arguably the greatest fighter of all time. Yeah, GSP was absolutely phenomenal. So much title defenses, 26-2, and even though he's not undefeated, he lost to Matt Serra and he lost to Matt Hughes. He managed to get those wins back in the future, so there has never been a man that has beaten GSP and then gone on to not lose to him in the future. His UFC run went from 2004 all the way to 2017, well, technically 2013, but then he came back and won a belt in a different weight class in 2017 when he beat Bisping. So he was a champion in 2 different weight classes, the greatest welterweight of all time. No welterweight was beating this dude. He was beating the likes of Johnny Hendricks. He was beating the likes of BJ Penn, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz, Thiago, everyone at the time this dude was beating. Everyone. He got his wins back over Matt Serra and Matt Hughes, Josh Koscheck as well. Nobody was beating GSP in his prime. He was so skilled. He was one of the best wrestlers. He was one of the best strikers. He was unstoppable in his prime in the welterweight division. He was so talented. And like I said, comes back years after retiring to come to the middleweight division and beats Michael Bisping, the middleweight champion of the world, for his belt, and just takes the belt off Michael Bisping when he was defending against Henderson. So I'm going to say that GSP is definitely, without a doubt, the greatest fighter to come from Canada. And because of how good his run was, arguably the greatest fighter of all time in the UFC because of how good his run was. And he was a clean athlete as well. A lot of these guys are roid heads. He was a clean athlete as well, fighting in an era where like a lot of these guys were on steroids as well. Like when he was fighting, who was it? Johnny Hendricks as well. When Johnny Hendricks was on steroids, got the win over him. Good win for GSP, and he's definitely the greatest Canadian fighter of all time. Then we've got Poland. Polish MMA has definitely risen in these last couple of years. At number 3, for the third greatest fighter to come from Poland, I'm going to go with the current lightweight contender, Mateusz Gamrot. There hasn't been too many Polish contenders in the UFC, but Gamrot has definitely done that, and he's had a really good UFC career so far. Debuted and he lost to Guram in an absolute war, then went on a big winning streak, had some really good wins. Diego Ferreira, one of the best unranked lightweights right now. Arman Sarukian, one of the top lightweights. Jeremy Stevens, Jalin Turner, Rafael Fiziev, Rafael Dos Anjos, and he did lose to Benil Dariush, but he's going to be taking on Dan Hooker at UFC 305, and I think he's got potential to fight for a belt one day. And the fact that he's got a really good resume, he's 24-2, he's had a massive run outside of the UFC, which has managed to grant him inside the UFC, and he's looked really good. He's a really good wrestler, he's Gamrot. I'm going to put him at the third greatest Polish fighter of all time. He's a real top contender. He's proved himself to be a top contender. He's got a really good resume already in the lightweight division, and I think he has potential to fight for a belt. So I'm going to say that Gamrot is the third greatest Polish fighter of all time. And number 2, I'm going to go with former champion Jan Blachowicz. This dude has definitely paved the way for Polish MMA. Absolute knockout artist, and he's got some really good ones on his name. Knocked out Luke Rockhold, KO'd him out cold. Jacare Salzer as well. Corey Anderson, KO'd Corey Anderson, which was a satisfying win. KO'd Dominic Reyes. Only stopped Adesanya from going up to the light heavyweight division when Adesanya was on an absolute run. undefeated in the UFC was Israel Adesanya, the unstoppable middleweight. Jan Blachowicz beat Adesanya for the first time in the UFC, stopping him in the light heavyweight. Well, didn't stop him, didn't stop the fight, but stopped him from winning the light heavyweight belt. Got that win over Rakic, but it was an injury. And even though he's had a couple shaky past few fights, he's lost to the best in the world. He lost to Glover Teixeira, a former champion. He had a draw against Magomed Ankalaev for the belt, and he lost to Alex Pereira and gave Pereira his toughest test in the light heavyweight division. I'm going to say that Jan Blachowicz is definitely the second greatest Polish fighter of all time. Former champion, top contender, knockout artist, got a really, really good resume in the light heavyweight division, and he's still a top contender in the light heavyweight division to this day. So I'm going to put Jan Blachowicz at number 2, and at number 1, the greatest Polish fighter of all time, I'm going to go with Joanna Jędrzejczyk, who is the only woman fighter so far to make the list. She's one of the greatest female fighters of all time. I mean, from 2015 to 2017, she was just beating everyone she was going up against. Jessica Andrade, Carla Esparza, everyone who she got put against, she was beaten, and she only lost to the best. Look, she only lost to people like Rose Namajunas, one of the best at the time, Valentina Shevchenko, one of the greatest female fighters of all time, Zhang Weili. The first fight with Zhang Weili was actually quite a competitive fight, and that was for the belt. And she had some good wins as well. Michelle Watson-Gomez, who somehow managed to get her own retirement ceremony. Tisha Pennington. She had some really good wins in the time, and she was so good at the time was Joanna Jędrzejczyk. So I'm going to say that she's the greatest Polish fighter of all time. A shit ton of defenses. Really good. One of the greatest female fighters of all time, and she only lost to the elite competition in Namajunas, Shevchenko, and Zhang Weili. So I'm going to say that she's the greatest Polish fighter of all time. And then we go to Mexico. Mexican MMA has definitely risen in these past couple of years. For the third greatest Mexican, and by the way, I'm doing actually Mexican, not Mexican-American, just pure Mexican. And number 3, I'm going to go with Yair Rodriguez. Yair Rodriguez, he is a top 5 featherweight in the world right now, which is actually impressive considering how stacked that division is. He's got some really good wins as Yair Rodriguez. Andre Fili, Dan Hooker, BJ Penn, Alex Caceres, Korean Zombie, Jeremy Stevens, Brian Ortega, Josh Emmett as well. Josh Emmett, well, I guess the Brian Ortega one was an injury, but beat Josh Emmett as well to become the interim champion. One of the only Mexicans to actually touch gold. And I know he was the interim champion, it wasn't the actual champion, but he still did it. Lost to one of the best in Alexander Volkanovski. Lost to Brian Ortega, I guess that was a bit of a bad loss. And then also lost to Max Holloway, but he's definitely one of the best kickboxers right now in the featherweight division. He's a former interim champion. He's got a really good resume. He's beaten so many top featherweights in the world. And I think we've got to give Yair Rodriguez his credit as the third greatest Mexican of all time. At number 2, I'm going to go with the current champion of the world, Alexa Grasso. Alexa Grasso's done really good in the UFC. Obviously she beat the best at the time in Valentina Shevchenko. We talk about Shevchenko being one of the greatest female fighters of all time. Alexa Grasso was able to beat her. She finished Valentina Shevchenko and then did really well in the rematch to keep the belt. She's the champion of the world. She's the defending champion of the world. We don't know how long this is going to go on for, but she's still getting these wins to this day. She's got really good jiu-jitsu and her striking is slept on. I'm going to say that Alexa Grasso, just because of what she's done in women MMA and the win with over Shevchenko, she's the second greatest Mexican fighter of all time. And then at number 1, the greatest Mexican, I'm going to go with the assassin baby, Brandon Moreno. Now, yeah, Brandon Moreno definitely had a good run in the lightweight division with a lot of good wins. I mean, he beat Kai Kara France twice. One of them was for the interim belt. He beat Brandon Royval as well. He beat Davidson Figueiredo, one of the greatest flyweights of all time, for the belt in one of the most historic title wins in UFC history, and he beat him twice as well. And he's only lost to Pantoja recently. Well, he lost to Brandon Royval. It was a very close fight. And then he lost to Pantoja, which was an extremely close fight against his kryptonite for the belt. And because he's won the belt on multiple different occasions and he's got a really good resume in the flyweight division, I'm going to say that Brandon Moreno is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. But that is my list of who I think the top 3 greatest fighters is from every country in the UFC. Let me know your thoughts on this list, if you agree, if you disagree, if you'd have switched anything around, and if I missed out any major countries. But let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.